All right, everyone, good morning and welcome to this public workshop. Brandon, if you could just click on the next slide.
Recording in progress.
Perfect, thank you. All right, welcome and thank you for joining this public workshop to discuss the proposed statewide NPDES construction stormwater general permit. We appreciate your participation while many people are concurrently dealing with the impacts on our communities due to the pandemic and turmoil abroad. I'm Ella Galovi, an environmental scientist at the State Water Resources Control Board, and I will be your facilitator for today. As we begin this public workshop, I'd like to introduce our program staff. We have Brandon Rosenboom, who will be presenting information on staff's response to comments and providing an overview of proposed changes in the permit. And following the staff presentation, Brandon and Cabe Silverhain will be available to answer any questions that you might have. Behind the scenes, we have Salvador Chaparro and Pushpa Zachariah. They're running the technical support end and managing Zoom. We have Reed Hashofsky. He is monitoring the Zoom chat and email for questions. We also have Matthew Shimizu. He's taking notes and providing support. And all of these folks and more have been working diligently on writing the permit, doing necessary technical research, managing and visualizing data, and responding to public comments. Additionally, we have Julian Lapidus, Nicholas Wong, and our Cal EPA webcasting staff who will be assisting with technical functions. Next slide. The State Water Board's mission is to preserve, enhance, and restore California's water resources for the benefit of present and future generations, which is why we want to begin this meeting by acknowledging groups who have and who continue to experience economic, environmental, and social disadvantages as a result of historical marginalization and whose daily lives are impacted by racism and injustices. As a reminder, our work here today should strengthen the empowerment of community voices as we collaborate to provide clean, safe, and affordable water to all Californians. Okay. All right, so during today's workshop, we will explain the continuing public process for the notice released on July 22nd, 2022. We'll provide a high-level overview of the proposed permit content and identify specific items that changed in response to comment and those that are subject to a limited scope public comment period. And we'll answer questions and provide clarification to assist interested parties in understanding the permit requirements. So proposed permit documents can be found on our program's webpage. And I'd also like to note that there may be one or two State Water Board members in attendance during today's meeting, but there will be no action taken, and this is not a board hearing. This workshop is being webcast and recorded, and it will be posted on the Construction Stormwater General Permit Reissuance webpage, along with the PowerPoint presentation. So today's presentation will provide information on the July 22nd, 2022 public notice and the proposed permit. This information will help interested parties to better understand the proposed permit and its requirements, prepare written comments for the revised anti-degradation findings, which we will define anti-degradation a little bit later on in this presentation. And also it will help interested parties to provide oral comments on the September 8th, 2022 State Water Board meeting. I'd also like to encourage you to subscribe to our Stormwater Construction Permitting Issues LIRIS messaging system to receive future notifications and updates regarding the construction general permit. All right, moving on to the Zoom meeting participation instructions. We encourage our workshop participants to take advantage of the Zoom meeting chat feature to enter questions and feedback throughout the presentation. At the end of the presentation, staff will respond to questions in the order they are received. And if you'd like to present your question and feedback yourself, please let us know and staff will unmute you so you can present your question yourself. So to leave a question or comment, click on the chat icon in the menu, enter your question or feedback, and indicate whether you'd like to present your question or feedback yourself. Okay, so the workshop schedule for today. Our public workshop is scheduled from 9 to about 12. So we'll begin by having staff present till about 10 a.m., followed by 2 10-minute presentations from interested parties. The interested parties include the Building Industry Association and Linear Utilities have requested to provide a 10-minute presentation, which should help foster discussions in the remainder of the workshop. So following the presentations, we'll take a quick 10-minute break before continuing on to our questions and answers. And the workshop will continue until there are no further questions or about 5 minutes before noon for some closing remarks.
And Ella, I did want to add just a little bit of correction there. The public notice actually noticed that this workshop would go until 1 p.m. And so I've corrected the slides to reflect that. Sorry, I didn't mention that earlier.
Oh, that's okay. Thank you for the correction. So till about 1 p.m. So we have additional hour. Great.
Yep. More
okay,
questions.
well, with that, Brandon, please go ahead and take it away for the staff presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. All right, everyone. Welcome to the proposed statewide construction stormwater general permit reissuance public workshop. Hopefully this will provide you a good background on the proposed permit requirements and get you all ready for the board hearing in September. So today's workshop will provide an overview of the permit reissuance process, the additional limited scope comment period for the anti-degradation findings, the response to the May 2022 limited scope comments, and a general review of proposed permit requirements. So first up, permitting background and process. We'll begin this presentation with some construction stormwater permitting context. The Federal Clean Water Act prohibits certain discharges of stormwater to waters of the United States, except for those with a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, permit. The Construction Stormwater General Permit is a specific NPDES permit that regulates discharges of runoff generated by precipitation over a construction site or other areas of active land disturbance. The State Water Resources Control Board adopted the existing NPDES Construction Stormwater General Permit in 2009 to regulate stormwater discharges associated with construction activities that disturb 1 or more acres of land. The 2009 Construction General Permit expired in September of 2014 and has been administratively extended until the effective date of a reissued Construction Stormwater General Permit. The proposed permit serves to implement regulatory requirements such as federal effluent limitation guidelines, statewide policies, and total maximum daily loads that became effective since the adoption of the 2009 permit. This permit reissuance has been in the works for quite some time, since before my time with the water boards, in fact, starting in 2016, where staff have been engaging with interested parties and releasing multiple drafts throughout this time period to refine the requirements of the proposed permit. The process has continued into 2021 and culminated with a release of the proposed permit reissuance in July of 2022 for the consideration of its adoption in September. Looking forward, we have several key dates to be aware of. Written comments for the second limited scope public comment period will be accepted until noon of August 23rd of 2022. For those looking to submit a PowerPoint presentation for the board's adoption meeting, those will be due on noon of September 1st, 2022. And of course, the board meeting to consider adoption of the proposed permit is September 8th of 2022. So, what are the primary differences between the permit the proposed permit and the 2009 existing permit? Well, those include the addition and revision of total maximum daily load implementation requirements, the addition of passive treatment technology requirements, the addition of notice of non-applicability criteria, a revised process for the notice of termination, updated implementation of the statewide and regional water quality control plans, and the addition of requirements for discharges from dewatering activities. Continuing on, other differences include the addition of some demolition activity requirements, the implementation of the federal sufficiently sensitive test methods rule, addition of programmatic permitting for linear projects, revised monitoring and reporting requirements, and then the removal of bioassessment monitoring and rain event action plans. So next we'll be discussing the item that the additional limited scope comment period focus on, the revised anti-degradation findings. During the first limited scope comment period, the State Water Board received comments on the proposed anti-degradation findings in the March 2022 draft of the permit reissuance. The revised anti-degradation findings are set forth in section IH2 of the fact sheet. Consistent with the anti-degradation provisions of 40 Code of Federal Regulations 131.12 and State Water Board Resolution 6816, the fact sheet includes findings for water bodies that do not meet water quality objectives and water bodies that exceed water quality objectives, which the findings refer to as high quality water bodies. The fact sheet explains that no anti-degradation findings are required for water bodies that meet but do not exceed the water quality objective for a particular pollutant. As the fact sheet explains, for ease of analysis, the findings use 1968 as the baseline water quality. Because the permit enrollment is available statewide, the State Water Board assumes that there will be discharges to both high quality waters and non-high quality waters. For water bodies that do not meet water quality objectives, the permit is consistent with the anti-degradation policies because the permit will ensure that existing uses are maintained and protected. Discharges authorized by this permit would not cause further degradation, nor would they interfere with the improvement of water quality of such waters. For high quality waters, the findings apply decision-making criteria set forth in the anti-degradation policies. The fact sheet was revised to include additional detail and provide some extra evidence supporting the State Water Board's analysis of regulatory alternatives. The State Water Board will be accepting additional written comments on only the revised anti-degradation findings, and those are due on noon of August 23rd, 2022. In addition to the revised anti-degradation findings, staff prepared responses to comments on 3 other items from the May 2022 limited scope public comment period. And those are the regulatory transition period, the retranslation of nitrogen-based numeric effluent limitations, and the TMDL related soil screening investigation and its associated total suspended solids numeric effluent limitation. We will start by discussing the proposed permit effective date and the associated regulatory transition period, but save the TMDL related limited scope comments for the TMDL implementation requirements section of the presentation. So proposed effective date. Staff is proposing an effective date of September 1st, 2023 for the construction stormwater general permit reissuance. This is roughly a year after the scheduled board meeting to consider adoption of the permit. This date was selected to allow ample time for State Water Board staff to enhance smarts to accommodate electronic submittals and provide the regulated community and stormwater professionals with roughly a year to prepare for new permit requirements, if the anticipated reissuance timeline holds. Additionally, the regulated community requested that the effective date be set during the drier period of year. And although we've been getting a little bit of rain this summer, September is generally still a drier part of a California year. The proposed permit released in July 2022 continues to offer existing dischargers a regulatory transition period, with one key difference from the previous draft, and that is the transition period has been shortened from 3 years to 2 years after the effective date of the reissued permit. Thus, permittees that enroll under the 2009 general permit prior to the effective date of the permit may continue coverage under the 2009 permit until August 31st, 2025. Any applications received on or after the effective date of the reissued permit must comply with the reissued permit's requirement. Okay. The next section is to provide a high-level overview of the major differences between the existing and proposed permits, starting with some of the more administrative changes. The reissued permit allows dischargers to submit what's called a Notice of Non-Applicability, or NONA, when a construction site is not hydrologically connected to waters of the United States. This is demonstrated through a no discharge technical report, which must be prepared by a California licensed professional engineer or professional geologist with hydrological expertise. Regional Water Board staff may review the no discharge technical report and require that the discharger reassess NONA eligibility if it is determined that there are errors in the report or if the site is indeed hydrologically connected to waters of the United States. Another administrative change is the proposal to include programmatic permitting for linear projects. Programmatic permitting allows linear underground and overhead project dischargers to submit a single notice of intent to obtain coverage for multiple non-contiguous linear underground overhead projects if they are located within one regional water board, consist of similar scope of activities, and have the same legally responsible person. Programmatic permitting can be used for all linear project types. Staff added a provision in the July 2022 draft for dischargers deploying Executive Order N7320 to obtain statewide programmatic permit coverage within 100 days of the reissued permit's adoption date, as to facilitate meeting the executive order's deadline to provide high-speed broadband internet access to California's rural communities. This only applies to these broadband projects that are outside of a construction project that is otherwise regulated by this permit. The proposed effective date of the statewide programmatic permitting option would be December 17th, 2022, if the permit is adopted on September 8th, 2022. The proposed permit incorporates a provision for dischargers, primarily large housing developers, to terminate residential lots that have unfinished yards and landscaping areas. In order to reduce the acreage, the dischargers must meet the following criteria. The residential lots have been sold to individual homeowners for residential use, and a certificate of occupancy or equivalent document is maintained on the site. The lot must be less than 1 acre of disturbance, and all construction activity conducted on the lot by the discharger has to be complete, and the discharger has to install temporary best management practices to stabilize the unfinished yards or landscaping areas. The discharger shall upload as an attachment to SMARTS documentation of a contract, such as covenants, conditions, and restrictions, requiring that the individual homeowner stabilize the yard and landscaping within 1 year and maintain temporary best management practices until stabilization is achieved. The proposed permit also allows a discharger to reduce monitoring when all construction activities are suspended at the project and the site is temporarily stabilized or buttoned up. The discharger is required to revise the stormwater pollution prevention plan in SMARTS through a change of information and must provide a revised site map as well as photo documentation of the temporary stabilization. That said, this still requires periodic inspections. Once by the qualified stormwater pollution prevention plan practitioner within 14 days of the approved change of information to switch to an inactive status, and then once monthly and also prior to qualifying precipitation events, and those can be done by either the qualified SWIP practitioner or their delegate. The discharger would need to submit another change of information in order to and updated SWIP in order to resume construction activities. The proposed permits reissuance notice of termination process has a few additional requirements compared to the 2009 permit. The notice of termination process now requires that the qualified SWIP practitioner conduct a final inspection to ensure that the permanent best management practices are functioning as intended, and that the site meets final stabilization conditions. The discharger is now required to submit photos and a final site map with the notice of termination as well. And as with the previous permit, a brief long-term maintenance plan is required to show that the post-construction best management practices and any low-impact development will be maintained to continue functioning as intended to protect water quality. This additional information is, if prepared properly, should facilitate the regional water board staff's effort to approve or return notices of termination within a timely manner. And as we've heard from dischargers over the implementation of the existing permit, that this process can take long. The proposed permit reissuance also includes a provision that automatically approves notices of termination if the regional water board does not take any action on that notice of termination within 30 days. And those actions could be accepting the notice of termination for review, denying the notice of termination, or returning the notice of termination with some comments. All right. Getting away from those more administrative changes, we'll be going into some of the monitoring and reporting requirements. The proposed permit identifies clear roles and responsibilities for qualified stormwater pollution prevention plan developers and practitioners, otherwise known as QSDs and QSPs. One of the objectives of the reissued permit is to require that a QSD spend a little more time observing site conditions each year, as well as increase communication with their qualified SWRCB practitioners when there is an issue that with the dischargers water quality. Additionally, throughout the implementation of the existing 2009 permit, many stormwater professionals, regulators, and members of the regulated community have witnessed poor performing QSDs and QSPs. The proposed permit now allows the water boards to suspend or rescind QSD, QSP certifications as an enforcement action should we receive a complaint about a particular QSD or QSP's work. Qualified SWRCB developers and practitioners certified through CASPO must take 6 hours of continuing education annually to remain in good standing with their certification. Staff agreed that continuing education is important, especially considering how best management practices are constantly evolving in the industry. In order to broaden the number of pathways for aspiring QSDs and QSPs to obtain their certification, any individual may recommend a course for the Deputy Director of the Division of Water Quality to consider as a prerequisite for the Qualified SWRCB Developer and Qualified SWRCB Practitioner roles. State Water Board staff and the Construction General Permit Training Team will review those recommendations and advise the Deputy Director's decision whether or not to consider one of those as a prerequisite course. Qualified SWRCB practitioners opting to delegate responsibilities to other individuals are required to provide training to those individuals based on the guidelines that the Construction General Permit Training Team prepared. The proposed permit includes foundational training courses such as roles and responsibilities of stormwater professionals, forecasting information, and reporting, as well as site-specific training for visual inspection, sampling procedures, and or the implementation of the stormwater pollution prevention plan and best management practices relevant to that delegate's assigned responsibilities. Staff find that this requirement is necessary to ensure that delegates are properly implementing stormwater management practices in order to comply with the permit. Okay. The proposed permit switches from precipitation accumulations to precipitation forecasts, giving dischargers more time to plan for their monitoring activities. Advancements in forecasting capabilities since 2009 have supported this change. A qualifying precipitation event is now initiated by a forecasted precipitation event of ½ inch or more precipitation in a 24-hour period. The qualifying precipitation event continues for each subsequent 24-hour period with a ¼ inch of forecasted precipitation or more, and it would end with two consecutive 24-hour periods with less than a ¼ inch forecasted. The post-qualifying precipitation event inspection may be done on either day where there is less than a ¼ inch predicted, or 48 hours after the event ends. All dischargers, regardless of their risk level or type, are required to conduct weekly visual inspections as a means to check up on best management practice implementation. As with the existing 2009 permit, dischargers are required to conduct pre, during, and post-qualifying precipitation event inspections. However, the proposed permit provides greater ranges and thus flexibility for when those inspections can occur. Excuse me. This graphic summarizes the qualifying precipitation event inspection process. When the National Weather Service predicts an upcoming 24-hour period of half an inch or more precipitation, the inspector must complete a pre-qualifying precipitation event inspection anytime from 72 to 120 hours prior to the onset of the storm. Once the storm begins, an inspection is required during working hours within the initial 24-hour period of precipitation. If the forecast was revised to less than half an inch before the event begins, an inspection must still be done if a quarter inch or more is forecasted. During qualifying precipitation event inspections are required for each subsequent 24-hour period when a quarter inch or more is forecasted, but not required during 24-hour intervals if less than a quarter inch is predicted. The qualifying precipitation event ends when there are two consecutive 24-hour periods where there are less than a quarter inch forecasted. The post-qualifying precipitation event inspection may be done during either of those two periods, as I mentioned before, or within the subsequent 48-hour period. This is a list of various inspections required by the Construction Stormwater General Permit and the specific personnel who are eligible to perform said inspections. The main takeaways here are that the qualified SWIP developers can perform any inspection required by the permit, as they are also qualified SWIP practitioners. The qualified SWIP practitioners must inspect for monthly, pre-precipitation, and notice of termination inspections. Trained delegates are mainly to assist the qualified SWIP practitioners during and after precipitation events and for weekly or inactive project inspections. Next, we will move on to more of the sample-based monitoring requirements. As a reminder, risk level 1 dischargers are not required to collect stormwater discharge samples, and that has not changed between the existing and proposed permits. That said, risk level 2 and 3 dischargers are still required to collect samples for comparison against the pH and turbidity numeric action levels established by the permit. However, a key difference is that dischargers are now only required to collect one sample per discharge location per day of discharge, and the numeric action levels are assessed on a per discharge location basis rather than on a daily site average. Thus, staff expects dischargers to collect less samples overall, but they may be required to perform corrective actions for more specific site drainages. This figure represents a 24-hour period divided into 4 6-hour quarters to demonstrate when qualifying precipitation event sampling could be done and would be repeated each day where there is discharge during an extended qualifying precipitation event. I have gone over this before in previous workshops, and I think it's fairly self-explanatory, so we'll go ahead and save some time there by continuing on. One of the other key monitoring requirements that the proposed permit relies on is non-visible pollutant monitoring, which was also required by the existing 2009 permit. Non-visible pollutant monitoring is required when any discharge has the potential to discharge a pollutant that was identified or should have been identified in the project's pollutant source assessment due to one of the following reasons. And that is a failure to implement best management practices, a container spill or leak, or a best management practice breach, failure, or malfunction. Dischargers are required to collect a non-visible pollutant sample every 24-hour period of discharge until necessary corrective actions are completed. And they do not have to sample if the pollutant is cleaned up or corrective actions are implemented prior to discharge. Okay. The next section likely represents the most significant change between the existing 2009 permit and the proposed permit, and that would be the proposed total maximum daily load implementation requirements. Total maximum daily loads are existing regulations that are incorporated into Regional Water Quality Control Board water quality control plans through separate public adoption processes. Total maximum daily loads address pollutants that cause impairments to water bodies by establishing a sum of allowable pollutant loading into a specific water body or watershed from all identified sources of that pollutant. Total maximum daily loads are not self-implementing and are implemented through the requirements adopted in MPDS permits or other board actions, such as the construction stormwater general permit. MPDS dischargers are considered point sources of pollutants and are assigned what is called a waste load allocation to limit the discharge of pollutants. Due to the variety of pollutants and waste load allocations assigned to address them, staff have developed multiple implementation strategies consistent with the assumptions and requirements of the total maximum daily loads. The intent was to streamline compliance by leveraging and modifying existing permit requirements where possible. Existing requirements in the 2009 permits, such as pollutant source assessments, source control best management practices, soil loss modeling via Russell II, and non-visible monitoring and other reporting are the basis for the total maximum daily load implementation requirements. There are four main categories of total maximum daily load implementation requirements. The first is compliance with the general permit, where those requirements are already sufficient to comply with the total maximum daily load. All four categories must comply with the general permit requirements. Compliance, the second would be compliance with erosion and sediment controls in the permit, paired with the revised universal soil loss equation model. To demonstrate compliance with the mass-based waste allocations, which are typically assigned for sediment and sediment-associated pollutants. Compliance with the total maximum daily load related numeric action levels is the third category, and that's to comply with concentration-based waste allocations assigned in the receiving waters. And lastly, compliance with total maximum daily load related numeric effluent limitations to comply with concentration-based waste allocations assigned at the point of discharge. However, as we will discuss in a few moments, some numeric effluent limitations were retranslated through the iterations of the proposed permit process. So how will construction stormwater dischargers know which proposed total maximum daily load implementation requirements apply to them? Well, there are three main steps. Step one would be to determine responsible discharger status. Does this project discharge into a total maximum daily load watershed or water body? Is the main question to answer here. The State Water Resource Control Board plans on providing a map tool to guide dischargers similar to the existing guidance for the industrial stormwater general permit, which is shown to the right. However, it is the discharger's responsibility to verify if the project's discharges actually go to a TMDL watershed or water body. The second step would be to perform a site-specific pollutant source assessment. Does this site have the main question here is, does this site have sources of the total maximum daily load listed pollutants? And is there potential for those pollutants to be present in stormwater discharges? If not, the total maximum daily load implementation requirements are not applicable to the discharge. Lastly, the discharger would refer to the proposed attachment H for any of the applicable total maximum daily load implementation requirements to determine which ones they must comply with. In the event that the discharger has to comply with a total maximum daily load related numeric action level or numeric effluent limitation, the discharger would assess their discharges through non-visible pollutant monitoring. All three of the following conditions need to be met in order to trigger total maximum daily load sampling. If any condition is not met, then sampling is not required by the discharger. First, the construction project must discharge to a TMDL listed watershed or water body. Second, the pollutant source assessment must identify a TMDL specific pollutant with a waste load allocation translated into either a numeric action level or numeric effluent limitation. And that has to have the potential to discharge into the listed TMDL watershed or water body. And then third, non-visible pollutant sampling must be triggered. Non-visible pollutant sampling is triggered when there is a failure to implement best management practices, there is a container spill or leak, or there's a best management practice that has been breached or failed or is malfunctioning. If the spill, leak, or breach is not fixed and cleaned and best management practices are not implemented prior to discharge, then non-visible pollutant sampling will be required. However, if the spill, leak, or breach is immediately cleaned and best management practices to control the pollutants are implemented prior to discharge, then non-visible pollutant sampling is not required. That said, TMDL-related numeric action levels and numeric effluent limitations cannot be exceeded with a single non-visible monitoring event. Steps 1 through 3 must occur again over multiple days of discharge within the same drainage area and during the same reporting year to be considered an exceedance. Exceedances of numeric action levels require that the discharger implement iterative corrective actions to address that pollutant, while exceedances of numeric effluent limitations are violations of the permit and subject to mandatory minimum penalties. Now that we've covered the basics of the proposed total maximum daily load implementation requirements, we can move on to our discussion regarding the May 2022 limited scope TMDL related items. The first of these two limited public scope comment items is the retranslation of nitrogen-based nutrients from numeric effluent limitations into numeric action levels. Throughout the reissuance process, staff has heard on multiple occasions that numeric effluent limitations, especially those for nitrogen-based nutrients, are infeasible to comply with using standard construction best management practices. On the other hand, staff has also heard support for the numeric effluent limitations as commenters claimed that this is how the total maximum daily loads were intended to be interpreted and implemented through NPDES permits. The proposed permit maintains the retranslation into numeric action levels, as staff has revised the fact sheet to further explain how numeric action levels are actually consistent with the assumptions of and requirements of the total maximum daily load waste allocations, and they are expected to be protective of water quality. Additionally, available data from industrial stormwater dischargers supports the expectation that most construction stormwater dischargers will be able to comply with the numeric action levels. The second TMDL-related limited scope public comment item was the proposal of a TMDL-related soil screening investigation and associated total suspended solids numeric effluent limitation for very specific waste allocations that address metals, organochlorine pesticides, and PCBs. These proposed TMDL implementation requirements would only apply to dischargers discharging into a water body or watershed addressed by the Los Angeles Area Lakes TMDL and the Los Angeles area, or the Los Angeles and Long Beach Harbor Waters TMDL. The discharger would conduct a soil screening investigation across the site to collect random samples according to a procedure that's outlined in the permit and analyzes them for the applicable total maximum daily load pollutant. If the results do not indicate that metals are present at concentrations above their waste allocations, or that organochlorine pesticides and PCBs are not present at concentrations above the reporting limit of the method used to analyze the soil, then the discharger is not required to comply with total maximum daily load implementation requirements. If the pollutants are found to be present and the discharger is, if the pollutants are found to be present, the discharger is required to comply with a numeric effluent limitation for total suspended solids set at 100 milligrams per liter. The numeric effluent limitation would be assessed at the same frequency as other TMDL-related numeric action levels or effluent limitations through the non-visible pollutant monitoring, which we just discussed. Based on initial research into the relationship between sorbed pollutants to soil and total suspended solids, the total suspended solids numeric effluent limitation is expected to provide the same level of water quality protection as numeric effluent limitations to address metals, organochlorines, pesticides, and PCBs, and is therefore an appropriate surrogate. That said, the proposed permit does contain total maximum daily load implementation requirements that will collect additional data and provide additional information regarding the correlation of these pollutants and sediment and stormwater discharges. Staff have also clarified that an exceedance of the total suspended solids numeric effluent limitation would equate to an exceedance of each of the applicable total maximum daily load specific pollutants that were identified in the soil screening investigation. For instance, if the discharger exceeds the, if the discharger identified both copper and lead are present in the soil, and the discharger exceeds the total suspended solids numeric effluent limitation through the non-visible pollutant monitoring procedure, then the discharger has violated a numeric effluent limitation for copper and lead. So that's 2 violations. Okay, and then we'll briefly discuss some other proposed requirements to save on time. The proposed permit also includes requirements for surface water buffers, essentially requiring that dischargers provide a 50-foot buffer where feasible. But dischargers also have the option of implementing best management practices that provide equivalent protection to a 50-foot buffer. And this would be done through, to demonstrate the equivalency, dischargers would use soil loss modeling. There are also some proposed requirements for active treatment systems. Under the proposed permit, dischargers are allowed to bypass active treatment systems if their discharge complies with the discharge prohibitions and numeric action levels of the permit. Additionally, the proposed permit reestablishes the 10-year, 24-hour compliance precipitation event following comments that we received during the April board workshop. The compliance precipitation event provides dischargers with an exemption to the technology-based active treatment numeric effluent limitations. The proposed permit also limits which treatment, or also contains proposed requirements for passive treatment technologies, which limit the types of treatment products can be used in passive applications that are applied to water. And these are based on toxicity and requires that the discharger hire a trained individual to calculate appropriate application rates for their specific site conditions. The proposed permit also includes requirements for dewatering activities. And so the proposed permit regulates dewatering activities associated with construction activities if there is no other applicable MPVS, de minimis, or low threat discharge permit issued by the state or regional water board. Lastly, there are post-construction requirements, which are mostly the same compared to the existing 2009 permit. The proposed permit removes the requirement to demonstrate why non-structural controls are not sufficient to achieve the post-construction water balance, but does require that all dischargers submit post-construction plans with their permit application. So that means if the discharger is complying with a phase 1 or phase 2 MS4 permit post-construction requirements, or if they're complying with the construction general permit requirements, they will still have to upload their applicable plans and calculations for post-construction requirements. These are just some extra slides to provide for reference when you post online. All right. So that concludes the staff high-level overview of the proposed permit requirements.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brandon. I can go ahead and transition on.
Sure.
Okay, great. So now we'll transition to the interested party presenters. So we have Ashley Parks from Exponent, who will be presenting on behalf, excuse me, of the Building Industry Association. Hi, Ashley, see you on video. And then afterwards, we have Julie Granberry of Southern California Edison, who will be presenting on behalf of the utility stakeholder group. So go ahead, Ashley, you can go ahead and start your presentation.
I am pulling it up for her as we speak.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect.
Just one moment. I'll take this for you. And just go ahead and let me know when you want me to advance the slide, and I'll be happy to do so.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Okay, is it shown?
All right. Yeah, so thank you again for allowing me to present to you all today. And thank you for your efforts on the revisions and comments and this workshop. So go ahead and next slide. All right. So first, I just want to say that we're very supportive of several of the changes you have made, and we appreciate all the effort and work you've put into this over the past several years. So firstly, we support your determination on the lack of feasibility for the anti-degradation alternatives 2 and 3. So we agree with your determinations there. We also continue to agree with you that the effective BMPs or treatment options for nitrogen compounds at construction site discharges are not available. So thank you for recognizing that. However, we believe that similar findings can and should be made for additional pollutants. So we believe that NELs and NALs are likely infeasible to meet with the non-ATS methods, including the new TSS NEL of 100 milligrams per liter. And we also feel that the derivation and application of the surrogate NEL for TSS remains unclear. The literature that we've reviewed we've not found relevant literature for California-based construction sites to support this TSS surrogate. Next slide, please. Another change that we're very grateful for you making is adding full section numbers throughout all of the permit documents. It makes it really easy to follow along. So again, it's a small change, but very, very much appreciated. Next slide, please.
It was no small effort.
Yeah, right. It's a minor change, big effort, and a lot of appreciation on our part. So thank you. Okay, and we also agree that the construction site BMPs do improve water quality for several different constituents. So this is your table 2. But we feel that the record does not support the idea that BMPs can meet all of the numeric effluent limitations and numeric action levels provided in Appendix H for construction sites. Next slide, please. So following along with that, we feel that there's more data that's needed to evaluate the ability of construction site BMPs and discharges to comply with the NELs and NALs in this permit. We've looked at data from the International BMP Database and various scientific literature, and that indicates that the numeric effluent limits for sediment can likely only be met using advanced treatment systems and not all of many of the BMPs that construction sites use currently. We don't feel that there's data that exists that evaluates completely the ability of construction BMPs to remove constituents, especially other than sediment. Specifically dissolved constituents. So as mentioned in the Appendix H table, the dissolved metals in Choyas Creek. So we don't feel that there's enough evidence supporting that BMPs can remove these dissolved constituents. And we also believe that typical construction site BMPs are unlikely to consistently meet the new surrogate NEL for TSS of 100 milligrams per liter. Next slide, please. And so more on that, we still feel it's a bit unclear on how to apply the TSS as a surrogate NEL. Specifically in the soil, comparing doing the soil screening, looking at the soil concentrations of the different constituents, which are typically measured in units of milligrams per kilogram, and how that really translates to the TMDL specific thresholds that are typically in milligrams per liter. So when you have different units, it's really difficult to make that comparison. So we'd appreciate a bit more clarity on how those levels relate to each other. Next slide, please. And we also believe, as I'd mentioned previously, that complying with the TSS surrogate limit is likely infeasible without advanced treatment systems. So we'd really appreciate more information on which construction site BMPs you believe can consistently achieve the TSS limit of 100 milligrams per liter and what the basis of that conclusion is. Or is it that you feel it will require ATS? I believe it was table 4 in the fact sheet showed a lot of the background TSS concentrations in different receiving waters, many of which were much higher than the 100 milligrams per liter limit. And in assessing the ability to comply, what is the basis for relating the NTUs or the turbidity measurements to the proposed TSS limit of 100 milligrams per liter? So I believe that was one of our previous comments as well, and we just prefer or appreciate some more clarity on that link between those two measures. Next slide, please. And I believe you'd address this in your comment, but just wanted to further confirm that if you do have a TSS exceedance, but in your soil screening, like you'd mentioned, copper and lead being measured, that would in fact be two violations or two exceedances. So
That
I
is
think
correct.
you addressed that.
Mhm.
Yeah. Next slide, please. And so overall, our requests are that the NELs should be converted to NALs or monitoring only. We just feel it's just as it's infeasible to comply with NEL values for nitrogen compounds using typical construction site BMPs, we feel it will also be infeasible to comply with the NELs for additional pollutants. And we'd really appreciate more data to be collected to support the next iteration of this permit. We also request to meet with staff to obtain additional clarification regarding the surrogate numeric effluent limitation for TSS. And we may have additional comments related to this. So yeah, thank you for your time.
I believe we have a meeting scheduled for later this week, so
Okay,
hopefully you can address your question.
Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Ashley. We'll go ahead and get into our second presenter today. If Julie Granberry can go ahead and it's my understanding that you'll be sharing your presentation. Just want to see. Julie is on. Perfect, there you are.
Hi there.
Hello.
Yeah, thank you for, I think Katie from SoCal Edison is maybe going to be sharing the screen. And if not, I don't know, Brandon, if you have our presentation as well. So
I do.
okay. So I don't know if Katie, I think the host has to unmute or give control. So I'm not sure if you found Katie Whiteside on the
Yes,
list
but
there.
it tells me that screen sharing is disabled for me.
South
Okay.
Dakota,
So I'm
are you
trying-
Brandon.
able to provide screen sharing capabilities to Katie?
Either that or you guys can. It's fine.
I'll go ahead and share it then.
Okay, thanks, Brandon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Sure. And I think while Brandon's getting the presentation shared, I can just give a quick introduction to our utility stakeholder group. Well, we're made up of all the utilities in the state, so Pacific Gas and Electric, SoCal Gas, San Diego Gas and Electric, Sacramento Municipal Utilities District, AT, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, and of course ourselves, Southern California Edison. So you can imagine we have a very large permitted community there, over 100 permittees at least just for our company. So we do have a big stake in this. We really do appreciate the State Water Board staff working with us over the years here. So thank you for that. And I see the presentation, so I think everybody else does, right? You can go ahead and go to the next slide. And we can get started with kind of just the utility specific concerns. And I know you may have heard some of this before in some of the previous comments, so we can move through some of it fast. And I think this first slide, really, sometimes we like to throw a little bit of visuals up there so people can understand the environment we're working in. A lot of times utilities with these long linear, either pipeline, transmission line, pump station, substation projects are in very remote areas, ridge tops. So I just wanted to kind of set the stage of the type of projects environment that we're working in with these long linear projects that most of us operate. So go ahead and go to the next slide. And I think we just have a handful of things we wanted to go over today. Similar to, I think, the building industry that just spoke, we really do appreciate some of the improvements that we've seen and working with you on getting these. So the NOT approvals, that's huge when we can be able to close out projects in a timely fashion. You can imagine with the volume of work and projects that we have, not having to continue those inspections every week for, over 100 projects really adds up. So really appreciate that. The safety exemptions that are there, also very important to the type and nature of work we do. Eliminating some of the more administrative items like a rain event action plan that really didn't add any value, all very good. Being clear that sampling is required when we actually have a discharge from the site, also very helpful. Using the precipitation forecast to trigger those pre-storm inspections, also very good. When we have inactive sites, again, sometimes when we have a stabilized area that not much is going on for a period of time, helps to be and not have to continue with those. So again, thank you for all these kind of enhancements. Next slide. We wanted to cover here for the more concern. The previous speaker covered well the TMDL and numeric effluent limit item that's I think come up as the biggest item for most permittees here. And again, it's that correlation with the TSS and some of these constituents, the ability to actually put BMPs out on these construction site projects and control those. So I think that's been covered really well. And I think, again, with the numeric action levels, it's more of a way for us to protect water quality, make changes and adjust in the kind of nature of construction field projects that we deal with. So again, would just really reiterate some more work or more discussions on those TMDLs, NELs. I think the next point here for programmatic permitting, it may just be posing a question because I think it sounds like from what we understand that we can use this tool, which is great when we have similar scopes of work that are occurring like these big long linear projects for us. So a positive tool, but curious on if there's enhancements to smarts or any training templates, things like that that are needed for this new tool in our toolbox, and will those be ready within that kind of 100-day window? So so we can kind of cover this the handful of things, Brandon, and then maybe I don't know if you want to go back and speak to any, but feel free to stop me as well.
Sure.
So okay.
All right, are you covering that next?
Yeah, we can go into the, you know what, I think there's only 5 items here, so we can cover them, and then if you want to go back and make any comments, that's fine with me.
Okay.
Kind of have an open discussion.
Actually, Julie,
Katie?
if you don't mind, I do think we do want clarification on the programmatic permitting. Since it'll be available 100 days after adoption of the 2022 permit, we would like clarification if that would, I believe on the slide you showed that we would be allowed to permit under the 2009 permit for the programmatic permitting 100 days after adoption of the 2022 permit until the 2022 permit comes into implementation, or until we have to add acreage.
Okay. So the one clarification I would like to make is that 100-day window, so the December 17th effective date, only applies to dischargers who are deploying Executive Order N7320, which is to install statewide broadband. So if SE is involved in that would apply for that. But for other more traditional linear utility projects, which is maybe a little bit confusing since we have traditional construction projects, but for things like wildfire mitigation, gas transmission, and electrical transmission, that programmatic permitting is proposed to go into effect with the effective date of the reissued permit being September 1st, 2023 as proposed. So to answer your question, kind of pertaining to that statewide programmatic permitting, they will be implementing the 2009 requirements because the 2009 permit is still effective 100 days from the adoption date. However, the more regional-based programmatic permitting requirements will be under the reissued permits requirements.
Okay, got it. That clarifies some of that then. Okay, all right. So go ahead and go to the next slide then. I think we can see next. The other thing, and I think this is again of note item, is for that regulatory transition period. We as a group of permittees do have several long range projects that do take, over 3 to 5 years to construct. So we may run into that. And with that feature of not being able to add acreage via change of information and going to that new permit after, especially a large involved project, it just may warrant maybe another meeting or discussion with staff to figure out the best way to deal with that, since it doesn't really work well when you do have several of these. I mean, most permittees maybe don't have projects that are that long in nature besides us and maybe some of the transportation agencies, but just something to note. And then I think number 4 there on sampling, removing the daily averages. I think we just wanted maybe some more clarification on the background of that. Oftentimes when we do have a site with maybe multiple discharge points or, a discharge that may go for a long period of time, sometimes if we do exceed that NAL and make BMP adjustments and then come back and continue to sample, you do see that improvement in water quality, which I think is the point of, this permit and permit coverage. So removing that kind of feature was just something that, just wanted to hear maybe some of the background on that. So because a single exceedance, so we do take understood that NALs, don't come with the penalties of an NEL, but again, we do take those seriously. So if it is an automatic one-time sample violation or exceedance, I should say, just a change for us and the permitted community, that would be good to hear some more background on. And then let's see, and I think this last point that we had, number 4, you can go to the next slide and then come back and speak. They're somewhat related here. So again, I think I mentioned in the opening positive for triggers for the pre-storm for that forecast. So that's good. That kind of gives us a solid, pre-storm mobilization kind of go. But for the post-storm, I think some of our inspectors may have a better way of describing this, but oftentimes when you do have these long linear projects that have multiple remote kind of spans, the actual precipitation is very different from what was forecast. So sometimes, sending someone to just go see physically if there's something that triggers the inspection and the rain gauge may be a lot more than needs to be. So I think we can talk through some of those examples, but I think actually, Brandon, you covered it in some of your examples in your presentation, so this may be not as big of a deal. And so I think these were the kind of main things that we were just going to point out today. So I don't know if there was any comments from staff or if we wanted to schedule separate time, or if anybody else on the call had additional comments. But again, thank you for the time. We appreciate kind of the collaboration with you guys. So, and if any of our my colleagues from the utilities have comments that you would like to add as well, feel free. But thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Julie. So I think now we can go ahead and get into our 10-minute break. Does that sound good, Brandon, or is there anything you wanted to maybe touch on beforehand?
I think we can go ahead and move on to the 10-minute break, and then hopefully these 2 presentations that our interest parties have shared will foster a little bit of, little brainstorming amongst our attendees today. And we can answer questions once we return from break, and hopefully that will touch upon some of the presentation materials that the interested parties offered us. But I also do plan on meeting with the interested parties in a separate meeting to discuss some of their concerns.
Okay, great. All right, we're a little bit ahead of schedule, but that will leave us plenty of time for Q&A. So we're going to take a 10-minute break, and Brandon, if you could just put that slide up, that the break slide. So it's almost 10:05, so let's come back here at 10:15. And in the meantime, go ahead and feel free to drop any questions you may have in the chat, but we'll also have time afterwards. So, okay, everyone, we'll see you at 10:15. All right, welcome back, everyone. It is 10:15. Brandon, if you can go ahead and get on the next slide. We'll go ahead and get into the question and answer portion of today's workshop. So as a reminder, please use the chat feature in Zoom to write any feedback or comments you would like for staff to respond to. And if you'd like to present that feedback yourself, please let us know and staff will unmute you. So far, we only have one question that has come in. So I'd like to encourage all of you, if you have any questions, please go ahead and drop them in the chat feature. First of all, I'd like Brandon and Cabe, if there's anything you'd like to touch on from our stakeholder presentations, feel free to do so now. And if not, I can then go ahead to that first question we received.
Cabe, did you want to take a stab at anything first? Otherwise, I was gonna go ahead and kind of speak to why daily averages have been removed for the site. I wanted to do that.
Let me address that one question there was about milligrams per kilogram versus milligrams per liter. So both of those are equivalent to parts per million. So the only real difference in them is that one is used when the matrix is solid, like a soil, and the other is used when the matrix is liquid. But since they're equivalent to parts per million, that's why we're using that interchangeability there.
Great. So I think Julie mentioned that there was some concern about how the daily averages work under the current permit and how that kind of promotes corrective actions on the part of the discharger in order to maybe they notice that their average is getting a little high, they're able to go and implement corrective actions to fix that. And so we ultimately decided to remove the daily averaging. I believe in the previous iteration of the permit, it was daily averaging still per discharge location, but we then required that dischargers would sample multiple times for each discharge location during a qualifying precipitation event. And we heard during the board workshop in April that for sites with a number of discharge locations, they would be required to excessively sample. And so what we decided to do was remove the need for multiple samples by removing the average. And so instead, yes, there is kind of an expectation that you may collect only one sample per discharge location, and that sample may be over a numeric action level. As was mentioned, numeric action levels are not violations, and they do just trigger additional iterative corrective actions. And then the requirements also allow the discharger to collect their stormwater sample when they think it's most representative during their 24-hour period of the most representative of their discharge flow and characteristics. So by choosing when they're able to take their sample, I think this should also kind of provide the flexibility in the terms of water quality at the site. Yep, that's all I have for that. Oh, Ella, I think you're on mute.
I'm so sorry about that. Thank you, Brandon. Are we okay to move on to the next question? Okay. Oh, and also just a quick reminder for those of you who are participating on the webcast, you can also send your questions via email to the Stormwater Help Desk email if you'd like for us to respond. And that email is stormwater@waterboards.ca.gov. Okay, so another question we have is from Jason Zhang, who works for the LA County Public Works. And the question is, how will the new permit affect the frequency of inspections by LA County Public Work inspectors? Previously, it is monthly for risk level 1 and twice a month for risk level 2 and 3.
Is that the end of the question?
That's the end of the question. Yeah.
Well, Jason, the existing 2009 permit actually does require weekly inspections. Just kind of cursory, you know, just checking on the BMPs, and that can be done by either the qualified SWRCB practitioner or their delegate. And so the new permit isn't really deviating too much from that, except there is a requirement for a qualified SWRCB practitioner to perform a monthly inspection. So I don't anticipate there being there may be an increase in this particular instance, because it sounds like the discharger is not conducting enough inspections for the existing requirements in the 2009.
Okay, thank you, Brandon. We received a few more questions here. Oh, they're direct to me, so I'll go ahead and just go from the chat here. Mary Alyssa, sorry, I can't see the full name here. Mary Alyssa would like to present a comment on her own. Salvador, would you be able to please unmute Mary so she can present her feedback?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Hello, staff. Good morning. My name is Mary Alyssa Rancier, and I'm speaking on behalf of Associated General Contractors of California. AGC is a member-driven organization with over 950 members specializing in commercial construction. While we see there were many changes made to the construction stormwater general permit draft language released on July 22nd, there still appears to be some problematic issues as language is currently written. First, AGC of California does support the anti-degradation findings in the staff report. However, the findings don't go far enough. We believe that the anti-degradation findings should be applied to CGP monitoring and reporting program in its entirety. Second, we support the red line proposed by the Construction Industry Business Labor Utilities Coalition, specifically to remove NELs for TMDL compliance and instead replace them with NALs. Third, we encourage staff to remove the 100 milligram per liter total suspended solid surrogate for organochlorine, pesticides, PCBs, and metals detection that are used for NEL and NAL compliance, as the surrogate lacks substantial evidence to support its use. Fourth, we encourage staff to remove the procedure for determining NEL exceedance and soils screening investigation requirements for NEL compliance. Lastly, staff ignored construction industry comments that were made in May 2022. Instead, staff cited from the November 2021 draft, which does not address the changes proposed by the State Board in the March 2022 draft release. We want to stress the desire to have an open process and the ability to engage and provide constructive feedback for board staff. We want to commend and thank staff for their efforts and inclusiveness in the development of this permit. And lastly, we encourage staff to consider the changes to the permit that would decrease the financial burden on these essential businesses. I just want to thank you for your time and your consideration.
Thank you for those comments, Mary.
Thank you so much, Mary. Getting a few more questions here. The question is, you mentioned needing to be a qualified person for doing the post-construction calculations. What specific qualifications are you looking for? You can present the question and please let me know if I misheard that designation. I'm sorry, that last part was for me, but Brandon, is that clear, or we can go ahead and unmute this person as well?
Well, let's go ahead and unmute them. I think there might be a discrepancy in our understanding.
Okay, the person is under L. Rosano. So Salvador, if you can please unmute L. Rosano.
Hi, my name is Lindsay. I thought you had mentioned something about a qualified person when it came to just deciding on the post-construction calculations, and I didn't know if you were looking for QSP, QSD, or engineering,
Gotcha.
or if I misheard that.
It might have been a miss or let's see. I think what I was trying to get at was that a qualified SWIP practitioner, or QSP, is required to do the notice of termination inspection. And that involves just confirming that the post-construction best management practices are implemented correctly.
Okay.
So QSP or QSD are both able to do that, but trained delegates are not.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. All right, the next question, there are two questions, so I'll read the first one from Ron Sklepko. For continuing education requirements, will the state board have a website with available courses that can be taken?
That's something that we can consider, although we generally don't try to promote certain courses over others, especially if they're not if they're private or third-party courses. However, our kind of expectation with that regard is that the underlying certificates, the prerequisite courses that QSDs and QSPs are required to take do involve continuing education. And so if they have to take, QSDs and QSPs have to take 6 hours to maintain their standing as a QSD, QSP, and they also have to take 6 hours, et cetera, for their underlying certification, those can be double dipped. So they can count towards both. So in most cases, the QSD and QSP will be able to meet their continuing education via their prerequisite certification. And then in cases for self-certified QSDs and QSPs, they do not need to go through this process because their professional engineering or professional geologist license is what qualifies them to serve as a QSD or QSP.
And Brandon, following up on that, the second question is, how does QSP, QSD show the state board that the 6 hours of training has been accomplished?
That's likely something that we'll have to work out with our partners, CASQUA, the California Stormwater Quality Association, and their contractor Office of Water Programs. So the construction general permit training team is kind of working out those details, and we plan to provide quarterly communication to QSDs and QSPs between adoption of the permit and the effective date to make sure we're all on the same speed. And I'll make note of that as something that we should work on as well.
Okay, thank you, Brandon, and thank you, Ron, for that question. Another question we have is from Leanne Ware, who is a QSD and QSB consulting firm, Quick Swip in Pleasanton. She's asking if there's a catalog of changes between the 2009 and proposed CGP, and if that's been shared, and if not, will one be provided before consideration of permit adoption in September?
So staff has prepared a catalog of changes, but it was for a previous iteration of the proposed permit. And so it's no longer up to date with the most recently released draft. I think we're pretty pressed for time for getting something like that out before the adoption period. But it's something that we can look into.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Leanne. Question from William Pan, who'd like to share his question himself. So Salvador, can you please unmute William Pan? And the comment is about the regulatory transition period.
Yeah, hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, William,
Yes.
Good morning.
All right, excellent. Thank you first for Brandon and Ella. You did a very good presentation. So during the presentation, we heard that the board is changing the regulatory transition period from 3 years to 2 years, but there was no explanation of the reason behind it. So Caltrain requests the board to revert the 2 years of regulatory transition period back to 3 years as originally proposed in March 2022, shortening the regulatory transition period from 3 years to 2 years will affect approximately 20% of Caltrain's project. Most of those projects will miss the 2-year period by a few days or just a few weeks and will be in the project closeout phase. A 3-year regulatory transition period will allow those projects to close out as planned without going through project re-registration and administrative work, which are not beneficial to further protecting water quality. Additionally, Caltrain suggests the Water Board to factor in the time it takes to approve a notice of termination when determining the reasonable regulatory transition period. With the proposed 2-year regulatory transition period, a NOT submitted a few days before September 1st, 2025, will have to seek for the 2022 CGP coverage. In addition, keeping a 3-year regulatory transition period will not increase the total number of projects grandfathered under the 2009 CGP, as all new construction projects filing for notice of intent after the effective date will be covered under the new CGP. So those are my our comments on the regulatory transition period, and we wish the Water Board can consider our comment and request. And again, on behalf of Caltrain, I appreciate the Water Board's effort, and we continue in collaboration with Water Board in the CGP reissuance. Thank you.
Thank you, Wilton. That was great feedback and provides excellent rationale. To answer your first question on why it was changed from 3 to 2 years, the regulatory transition period, the primary reason was that we received very strong opposition in our limited scope comment period from a couple of stakeholders. And the main reasoning there is that the permit has been, the 2009 permit has overextended its, I guess you could say its lifespan, or effectiveness. And so, you know, it's been implemented for almost, 8 years past its expiration. And the main comment there was that extending this via the regulatory transition period just seems to be overkill. And we decided to move it to, or to change it to 2 years past the effective date, mostly because staff determined that 3 years total, so if you include the year between adoption and effective, and then the 2 years after effective, staff determined that 3 years, which was is an appropriate transition period based on the average and median construction project durations recorded in SMARTs. That said, as Julie and yourself have explained, you know, linear construction projects and roadway projects or transportation projects are generally on the higher end of project durations. And it was more just kind of striking a balance with the other dischargers as well.
Great, thank you. Well, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, Brandon, I understand that. However, the permit, the 2009 permit got administratively extended. That is not something that Caltrain has a say in it, and it is what it is. However, the regulatory transition period is the merit that allows existing projects to phase out under the existing 2009 permit without causing much unnecessary administrative work and not creating more confusion on both sides, both the discharger and the regulators. So having that said, we still think 3 year would be more appropriate. And like I presented earlier, there will be more than 20% of the projects get affected or just caught in tail. And so it's really not that reasonable to have just 2 years and have those 20% projects get caught in tail and then create a headache for both sides. And so that is what we are suggesting. We heard your reasons why it got changed from 3 years to 2 years, but we still think changing or reverting back to 3 years would be more appropriate. And I suggest the board take our recommendation and discuss and think thoroughly and see which one is more reasonable to go by. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Willem, for your questions, for your comments and feedback. All right, we'll go on to our next commenter, who is Shra from Contra Costa County Public Works Department. And the question is there a website or database by which we can determine TMDLs for receiving water bodies adjacent to our project sites? I believe I have used a map feature on the Water Board website to identify 303D sediment impacted waters. So I was wondering if there was a similar feature.
That's a wonderful question, and we touched a little bit upon it during the presentation. Staff is looking to provide a map tool, either similar to the receiving water tool, but probably more similar to the industrial general permits tool, which outlines which total maximum daily loads are applicable to industrial dischargers and for what pollutants. And so we plan on providing something similar for the construction stormwater dischargers. We have two talented data visualizers, both in Ella and Reed on staff, and so hopefully we are able to provide a functional tool that will help dischargers determine their responsible discharger status.
Thank you, Brandon, and thank you, Shroff, for your question. There was a question about the email address that you can submit your questions to as well. It was dropped in the chat, and that is stormwater@waterboards.ca.gov. Okay. All right, the next question is from Cody Phillips. And the question is, for the nitrogen-based nutrient limits, you said that dischargers are not expected to exceed NALs based on data collected for industrial stormwater dischargers. Can you clarify how you reached this conclusion if construction sites are not expected to use the same BMPs as industrial sites? And that is the end of the question.
Good question. Maybe something that might take a little time for me to respond to.
Do you want me to jump in, Brandon?
Sure, Serena, might be helpful.
Hi, everyone. I'm Serena Liu from the Office of Chief Counsel, and our explanation on why we think the construction discharges should comply with the NALs is in the fact sheet. But just as a general explanation, we don't have construction data. So obviously that would be the most ideal thing that we could look to, past construction data relating to nutrients. So we want to acknowledge that we don't have that data, and that would be best. But as a next best option, we wanted to look at what is available. So acknowledging, yes, the industrial general permit is a different permit. Their BMPs might be different. And they also might have different risk level because many of the industrial facilities that are covered actually may be processing nitrogen-based products or manufacturing them. And they actually may have a higher risk level than many construction sites. But this was our attempt to use the data that was available. And so it may not be perfect, but it's what we had.
Great. Thank you, Serena, for that response. Thank you, Cody, for your question. All right, the next question is from Wiley. The question is, currently the OWP website does not monitor expired prerequisite certifications. Will there be a method determined to make sure that prerequisite courses are kept in current standings?
Again, similar to the question before, that is something that we will have to work out with CASPA and the Office of Water Programs. But like our intent is to, yes, likely update the QSD tracking tool to have that functionality. But we'll have to see what exactly can be done in that regard.
Great. Thank you, Wiley, for your question. Right, the next one is from Taylor Elsie. And the question is, between the original 2009 permit and this one, have there been any environmental markers on any bodies of water throughout the state that show the progress of how the waters have been impacted? For example, a better water quality that is measurable.
To be honest, I'm not aware of any particular markers other than potentially the I think it's triennial 303D list that's issued as part of the integrated report. That report should be demonstrating that water quality is either improving by delisting impaired water bodies or degrading by listing new impaired water bodies. So I haven't done an in-depth review of whether or not a lot of sediment impaired or sediment associated pollutant impaired water bodies have been delisted. And I'm not sure that the integrated report also provides the level of detail as to whether it's the construction general permit that resulted in it being delisted. But it's a great question and certainly something that I'd like to look into in the future.
Great, thank you, Taylor, for the question. We'll move on to Jane. It looks like she sent you, Brandon, I think she sent you something directly.
Oh.
But I think I could just say it here. What is the timeline for response once the Regional Water Board has accepted for review the NOT? This is assuming they have provided this response prior to 30 calendar days after the date of the NOT submittal.
That's a great question. So currently there is no proposed additional timeline once the Regional Water Board takes an action on the notice of termination. So a lot of comments that we've heard from dischargers is that, okay, well, sure, you gave us the 30-day automatic approval if they don't take an action, but what's going to stop a Regional Water Board from accepting something for review and then just letting it sit? And my answer to that would be internally, the stormwater programs at both the Regional Water Board and State Water Boards are going to work on just strategies in order to optimize our approval and review or denial of notice of terminations. And that's largely going to be based on the information that comes in as part of the notice of termination. So we're asking for additional information such as photos of stabilization and site maps, and then an inspection report from the qualified street practitioner to hopefully expedite the process. The way it kind of works is that notices of termination, once they are accepted by a staff member at the Regional Water Board for review or for some sort of action, it is tied to that person's name within our system. And so it's going to be up to our managers to kind of make sure that those are being addressed in a timely manner. And it's something that I think our program strives to as well.
Great. Thank you, Brandon, and thank you, Jane, for your question. All right, this is the last one I have right now from Brian, and then I saw there were a few that came in via email that I'll transition to. Brian's question is regarding section D2J1. Dischargers shall begin maintaining, repairing, and/or implementing design changes, reviewing alternatives that have not been used yet, to BMPs within 72 hours of identification of failure or other shortcomings, and complete the changes as soon as possible prior to the next forecasted precipitation event. And so the question is, if unsafe conditions are non-conducive to beginning maintenance, repairing, or implementing design changes within 72 hours, for instance, a basin wall failure during a storm or other failure, what are the dischargers' compliance options?
Can you repeat that last part of the question again?
Yeah, the last part, I'll just repeat the question.
Okay.
If unsafe conditions are non-conducive to beginning maintenance, repairing, or implementing design changes within 72 hours, for instance, a basin wall failure during a storm or other failure, what are the dischargers' compliance options?
Gotcha. Well, the permit does provide exemptions based on safety and access. So the discharger doesn't necessarily need to conduct visual inspection or conduct monitoring of stormwater discharge via sample collection if the site is not accessible. So I think what would happen in this scenario is, say something could not, so say a BMP failed and could not be addressed within that 72, or that 70, it wouldn't be identified within that 70, or sorry, trying to think it all through. Okay, so if the site has not been able to be safely accessed, the discharger would not have identified that the BMP needs to have maintenance or repair. And so as soon as they are able to access the site and then conduct a follow-up inspection, that's when that 72 hours would begin. If that makes sense.
Thank you very much, Brandon, and thank you, Brian, for your question. Was there something else you wanted to add, Brandon, or I can transition to the emails?
Okay, I was just going to say I had another direct message question.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I was scrolling through my chats. So hopefully I don't miss any more. But this comes from Katie, and the question is there any discussion of reducing the summer month dry season weekly inspections requirement similar to the US EPA's National Construction General Permit update? At this time, we're not proposing that. And I think that's kind of all I have to say there. But weekly inspections can be done by trained delegates, so on-site staff, and don't necessarily have to be a qualified stormwater professional. So there shouldn't be too much of an issue there. And kind of our main rationale for not reducing that would be that it is possible for there to be a qualifying precipitation event during the summer months. And so, especially this year, it seems we're having a little bit more monsoonal type weather. And I've recently heard of flash flooding up in the Sierras as well as in Death Valley. And so, those aren't necessarily areas that have a ton of construction, but it just represents the possibility of a precipitation event during the summer, and therefore the need to implement best management practices and to stay up on those and continue monitoring them throughout the drier months as well.
Brandon, were there any other specific questions directed to you that you want to go over?
Oh, yes. Okay, so there seems to be one from during the presentation. Regarding slide 36, sampling times. Is sampling required when safety of collecting samples is concerned? I think I just touched upon that in my response to, I believe, Brian's question. And that is, no, if safety is a concern, then the discharger would kind of document why they were unable to collect samples during a qualifying precipitation event, or why they were not able to conduct visual monitoring or visual inspection. And that would be in the inspection checklist.
Okay, great, Brandon. I'll go ahead and jump to an email question we received from Dave Sluga. And so he begins by providing some language from attachment D here. So attachment D, section 2F, additional risk level 2 and 3 requirements. Similar language in attachment E. 2F3 says maintain and protect all storm drain inlets, perimeter controls, and BMPs at entrances and exits. For example, tire wash off locations. And so there's a comment here that says, compared to the 2009 CGP, this language is very direct concerning drainage, inlet protection, and could pose dangerous safety issues because of local flooding and the traveling public. I suggest you include similar language that is included in the 2022 EPA CGP as follows, which from the EPA CGP, it's in 2.1.2, and it's written as design and install all stormwater controls in accordance with good engineering practices, including applicable design specifications. Thank you, Dave, for that comment. Brandon, is there anything you'd like to comment on that, or should I move on to the next?
No, I think we just noted that, and we have that via email, his recommendation. So thank you for that, David.
Yeah, thank you, David. The next question is from Hamid Rokni. The permit requires the SWIP and its BMPs to be site specific. How does the new inspection requirements comply with that? The permit requires the SWIP and its BMPs to be site specific. How does the new inspection requirements comply with that?
The new inspection requirements are very similar to the existing 2009 permits inspection requirements. And I'm not quite sure how this question kind of works out. So the SWIP does have to be site specific, and would therefore the discharger would identify which best management practices they are implementing on the site. And this would also be identified on a site map. The inspector for the site, so whether that be a trained delegate or a qualified SWIP developer or practitioner, would likely rely on that map to see which best management practices are being implemented, and then go review those or go inspect those. And so in that regard, I think it's site specific and would require that any of the inspectors are knowledgeable of the types of best management practices that are being implemented on the site. Hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Hamid, for your question. All right, we have another question from Dave. The question is, the qualified precipitation event inspections are somewhat confusing. Use a real-world NOAA information, for example, forecast weather table interface, actual rainfall intensities, construction business hours, etc., for pre-QPE, during QPE, post-QPE, and water quality sampling.
I can address that, Ella.
Uh-huh.
Well, we do assume that QSP or QSD will use the NOAA tables when they're trying to figure out if it's going to be a ½ inch for a 24-hour period. But something like rainfall intensities, that's only calculated after the rain has already fallen. So that is sort of a throwback to the old permit. And also there's rainfall intensities are not they are highly correlated to erosional events, but it's just not something, that data is not something that's readily available to most contractors or dischargers. So it's very useful information and research, but it's not that useful for wondering whether or not you're supposed to do an inspection or sampling. But the non-working days, like the weekends and holidays, they are excluded from sampling. So when a discharger is looking at the weather forecast, if it says that as particularly where the Weather Service has it hourly, and it only shows like say 0.3 of an inch on Friday, and then the rest of the rain on Saturday and Sunday, then that would not be a qualifying precipitation event.
Thank you, Cabe, for that feedback. Another question here from Dana Christensen. Who can perform specific inspections? It was shown that the trained delegate cannot perform pre-precipitation event inspections. I was hoping for more clarification on the reasoning why the trained delegate cannot perform those inspections. I'm not sure why they would not be capable of performing a pre-event inspections. You may have touched on this earlier, but if you can just clarify for Dana.
Yeah, I think the intent of requiring the qualified split practitioner to conduct the qualifying precipitation event inspection was to ensure that they are actually going out to the site on a regular basis and making sure that it's buttoned up prior to the precipitation event itself. What we've noticed through implementation of the 2009 permit, and this comes from both stormwater professionals and other regulators at the regional water boards, and sometimes even dischargers, that trained delegates are not always the most apt for conducting the inspections and then making sure that corrective actions occur before the precipitation event begins. So it's our hope that with this requirement that the qualified split practitioners are going to spend more time on the site, and we have provided them with a wider range of when they can conduct their pre-storm inspection. And that way they can make sure that the site is ready to go when the precipitation event begins. Yeah.
Thank you, Dana, for your question. I'm going to go back to the Zoom chat. There are a few more that came in. There's a question from Andrew. I'd like to understand the reasoning behind the during QPE and post QPE changing from an accumulated amount to a forecasted amount. And they can also give an example of where this may be problematic. Andrew, if you'd like to provide a little more information or the example, we can go ahead and unmute you. Salvador, Andrew, Sidar, if you can unmute them, please. If they're available.
Good morning. Thank you. I think Cabe might have slightly answered this just on the previous QPE question, but I guess kind of a two-parter. First off, is there a minimum forecast amount for the during and post that 1/4 inch, or could it be like 5% forecasted for 1/4 inch triggers that during storm amount?
Gabe, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand that. So the qualifying precipitation event, that's a 1/2 inch for that first 24-hour period. And then after that, we require inspections anytime it's forecast to be a 1/4 inch or more. And so the during storm ones are days when it's forecast to be a 1/4 inch or more. And those numbers come from a couple of different lines of research. One is that 0.4 of an inch is kind of the erosion threshold. So we're being a little bit liberal and using a 1/2 inch for the first one, but then after that first 1/2 inch of rain, a 1/4 inch will still mobilize sediment. So that's why we're using the 1/4 inch, and then the same for the end of the storm. If it's less than a 1/4 inch for 2 days in a row, it's fairly unlikely that enough sediment discharge will be occurring to be of any concern. So that's where those numbers came from.
So Andrew,
Yes,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so I think that was partly my question, was that 1/4 inch, once we get into the during and post qualifying precipitation event inspections, is it say 5% forecasted at 1/4 inch would trigger it, or does it have to be 50% forecasted at 1/4 inch? Is there a percentage that we're looking at as well?
So that's more of a probability of precipitation type.
Correct.
Statistic.
Yeah, I think we've decided that any time it's predicted, regardless of the percent prediction, and this is kind of it was kind of a nod to the North State dischargers, where they can definitely get discharged. I mean, they definitely get rain a lot of times when it's only predicted to be like, a 40% chance or 50% chance. So I think we dropped that percent chance, didn't we, Brandon?
Yes, I believe we did.
And then, so yeah, I guess my follow-up, just wanted to give 2 examples where I see this being problematic. So going to the during QPE inspection, say the forecast shows over a 1/4 inch per day, but it actually doesn't end up raining on either of those days. We're sending out an inspector to be on site when it's not raining. And then conversely, if you have a post QPE, states 2 consecutive days of greater than a 1/4 inch forecasted. But what if there's, say, 5 days straight that are under a 1/4 inch? We'd still be required to go out and do a post-storm or post-QPE inspection, and it could still be physically raining on site. So is that still the intent?
Correct. On those, if you choose to do the inspection on the 2 days where less than a 1/4 inch is predicted, it could be raining on the site. And that's why we also give the option for doing the post inspection within 48 hours after the rain has stopped. So there's actually a 96-hour period when the post inspection can be done, post-storm inspection.
And then going to the during QPE, that is kind of, I think, something that comes along with this style of monitoring, where you may in fact send an inspector out, but it doesn't end up raining. Not sure what else can be said there. Okay, do you have input?
I mean, that was a bigger problem in the existing permit, because in the existing permit, we said, the inspection has to happen when there has been a 1/2 inch of rain. So say it starts raining at 10 in the morning, the inspectors are waiting to see if it's going to be a 1/2 inch, or guessing whether it's going to be a 1/2 inch before the end of the day. And so a lot of times that precluded inspections earlier in the day, and so that it's just an inefficient use of people's time, and sometimes they would go out and sample and it was only 0.4 inch that rained, and so then they've got the samples that they don't really need to turn in. So this new procedure is sort of designed to address that problem, that you don't want to have inspectors waiting around all day to see if it's going to rain a certain amount. And so if it's predicted, then you go out. So if it's predicted to be a 1/2 inch, but it only rains 0.4 inch, you would still sample, and that would still be considered a qualifying precipitation event. And I think, and what Brandon mentioned about the advances in prediction, I honestly think that the forecasts are, when you actually look at the statistics about prediction versus what actually happened, it's gotten a lot closer in the last 10 years.
Yeah, I guess I slightly disagree. If we're comparing to the 2009 permit, I wasn't aware that there's a 1/2 inch threshold for during storms. I thought it was just 24 hours during extended rain events. And so I guess my general point is why are we stepping away from the 2009 standards? It seems like this is just causing more confusion on when QSPs or their delegates need to get out and do these inspections.
I think, I mean, the way I see how or interpret the 2009 permit is that you need that initial half inch of accumulation in order to trigger your monitoring. And then for every day after, if there's any precipitation, that's considered a continuation of that precipitation event. And so I think what we were trying to address with our new method is kind of having a forecasted stop to the precipitation event rather than just allowing small accumulations that might not cause as much erosion over the course of the event, be the kind of the delineator, I guess. But Andrew, you know, we're welcome to talk about this in a meeting offline too, especially if we're meeting with the utility stakeholder group, and hopefully we can see what we can, you know, further discuss it.
Yeah, sure thing. Appreciate it, Kate and Brandon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And there's actually a question following up on this discussion from Leanne. The question is, does there have to be at least 24 hours following the continued event ending before the post-event inspection can be done? Or can the post-event be done anytime after a continued event ends up to 96 hours after that time?
If I'm understanding the question correctly, the post-construction, or sorry, not post-construction, the post-qualifying precipitation event inspection is based on forecasted amounts. So for instance, if you can say you're on the last day of a forecasted amount where it's over 1/4 of an inch of precipitation, and the rest of your forecast says that you're expecting less than 1/4 of an inch per day or no rain at all, etc. Then that's your signal to consider conducting a post-construction, or keep saying that, post-qualifying precipitation event inspection. So I think that was kind of the info actually.
Okay, thank you, Brandon, and thank you, Leanne, for that. Yes, she said perfect. Yes, thank you. All right, moving on to a question from Arthur. Question is, if a transportation project under the construction general permit wants to establish a batch plant or crushing plant for use on the project only, does it require to obtain an industrial general permit?
I used to know this answer too, but it's been a long time since I've been asked it. I might have to get back to you on that, Arthur.
Yeah, I think unless Pushpa, if you'd like to respond to this, but I think it depends. There are other factors that can impact whether they would need industrial general permit coverage. I don't think it's just a quick yes or no answer. There are other factors that we need to consider. You're more than welcome to also email us, and some from the industrial team can respond. Or if there's anyone online who would like to respond from the team, you're welcome to go ahead and do that now.
Yeah, like Ella had said, just email us about the specific situation and we will get back to you on that.
Great. Thank you, Pushpa. Thank you, Arthur, for your question. We have another question from Andrew. The permit states that both the QSD and QSB must perform a visual inspection in the event of an NAL exceedance. Is that the case, or should it be one or the other?
It is the intent of the permit to have both of the qualified stormwater professionals, the QSD and QSP, conduct a, I guess you could say, a post-exceedance inspection. And the intent there is to kind of force a little bit of communication between the two. These inspections are required 14 days after, or within 14 days after the exceedance of the numeric action level. And so it's not necessary that the qualified SWIP practitioner and developer are there at the same time. But the thought process there was that by having them both inspect and kind of see what's going on, they would communicate with each other better of how to implement these SWIP.
Thanks, Brandon. And there's another question from Andrew to follow up. What level of post-construction plan is required as part of the PRDs? Will preliminary water quality plans be accepted? Oftentimes, grading permits require a WDID prior to water quality plans being finalized. Not issuing a WDID until a final plan is developed may cause an endless loophole.
It's a great question. The permit is a little vague on what level of detail that we're expecting as far as post-construction plans and calculations go. And so I think what we're intending by that is, you know, when you're applying for coverage, and I know there are some tricky local permitting scenarios where you might need WDID coverage before you get granted your building permit or grading permit. I would say that as far as applying for the construction stormwater general permit with your notice of intent, the post-construction plan should be what is available and as developed as possible. And regional water boards will understand if a change of information needs to be submitted to update the post-construction plans, should they change or should they, you know, just be finalized. But ideally we would have them as close to finalized as possible at the forefront of construction, or at the forefront of current coverage.
Okay, thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Andrew, for your questions. Katie Whiteside would like to ask a question herself about post-construction documentation. I think, Katie, you might already be able to unmute yourself. But if not, Salvador, can you please do that?
Yes, I'm unmuted. Thank you. So, Brandon, you answered it a good bit, I think, based upon Andrew's question. Really, it is about the fact that sometimes we don't have the information pulled together, again, at the time of permitting, and some of our projects are so large and spans several years. And so it may take us some time to get approvals through the MS4s for the post-construction when it does apply to our projects. So it is a little bit hard for us to upload information when we're still working through what that's going to look like.
Mm-hmm.
It would be great if just as a suggestion, I understand where you're coming from, but it would be great if it could be tied with the notice of termination instead of the notice of intent or the PRDs. And it's for that reason alone. It's because it does take time to work through this, and sometimes the projects do change. I noticed you stated that if project changes, you could go through the COI process to change it, but still, sometimes it does take a while to get agreement on what that's going to look like.
Mm-hmm.
And especially if you're working with where you have only a right-of-way and you don't actually own the land. So it's multiple parties involved, so it's easier, again, if we could tie it with the notice of termination and just make sure that it is uploaded and the information is there and we've provided it prior to trying to terminate the project.
All right. Thank you for that recommendation. And I was just looking at the requirements in the permit right now, and that kind of caught my eye when it said permit registration documents through SMARTS, and then also requiring that the approved plan or the plan be approved by the municipal separate storm sewer system jurisdiction. And so, as Andrew pointed out, there are instances where you might not have those approved yet prior to needing to file your permit registration documents. So I'll look into what we can do there.
Thank you.
My one counter I'd say for tying it with the notice of termination is that there have been times where I've heard that notices of termination will be rejected based on the post-construction plans and calculations not being either accurate or not being up to the requirements of the MS4, and that leading to delays in the closeout of the project. And so I think what we were hoping to get by having them tied up to the front is that, regional water boards will have the entire duration of the project to kind of review the plans. But as we all know, construction is dynamic and things change, so that might not be to the greatest benefit either.
Okay, so again, going back to, so when we are preparing these post-construction plans to be in compliance with the MS4, the MS4 it's their responsibility to make sure that it's in compliance with the permits that they are implementing, which does roll up to you eventually. But again, so you're asking regional board members to approve plans from what you're describing that the MS4 should be approving. I think really if it's in the territory of an MS4, it should be just demonstrating that we met the requirements of the MS4's requirements, and that should be satisfactory, and not waiting for and not burdening the regional staff with having to approve them as well. It really should be in the jurisdiction of the MS4 if it's falling under the MS4's requirements, I would think.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind and take a look at that section.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. There are a couple questions we received through the Stormwater inbox. There are 3 from Paul Costa. So the first one is, there is a 70% vegetative cover requirement for the permit can terminate. Is this a new requirement or is it the current CSP? Secondly, is there a way to waive this based on good faith efforts, especially in time of drought where irrigation may not be allowed to help in restoration efforts?
Oh, sorry, I got sidetracked by it, by other discussions.
Oh, that's okay. Would you like for me just to repeat that first question?
Yes, please.
Okay. There is a 70% vegetative cover requirement before the permit can terminate. Is this a new requirement or is it in the current CSP? Secondly, is there a way to waive this based on good faith efforts, especially in times of drought where irrigation may not be allowed to help in restoration efforts?
Great. Thank you for repeating that. That is a requirement under the current CGP for stabilizing a site. There are 3 options that a discharger under the I should caveat that under the 2009 permit, the 70% vegetative cover was the preferred method for final stabilization by most regional water boards. The existing 2009 permit also has provisions that allow dischargers to demonstrate final stabilization through soil loss modeling through the revised universal soil loss equation to soil loss model, or through a custom method that's approved by the regional water board. And those are to provide flexibility in how a site can terminate based on all the different factors that a construction site might encounter, such as environmental conditions, arid conditions, or drought, that may impact the ability to stabilize via vegetative cover. The proposed permit continues this and or continues those 3 options for stabilizing. There isn't necessarily an exemption, but a discharger will have to work with the regional water quality control board to determine how best to stabilize the site if vegetative cover is not feasible due to drought conditions.
Thank you, Brandon. The second question from Paul is there was a mention of a 2-year phase-in. Could you elaborate? What happens if a site under the old CGP were not able to close it due to either pauses in work or the revegetation rate? Would an existing CGP be forced to meet the new requirements once adopted if unable to close in 2 years?
Yes, that is correct. So this phase-in is what we're calling the regulatory transition period. And that allows a discharger who applied for regulatory coverage under the existing permit, the 2009 permit, prior to the effective date of the reissued permit. So they're allowed to continue their 2009 permit coverage until August 31st of 2025. If for whatever reason that discharger is unable to complete their project under the 2009 permit requirements by August 35th, 2025, they will likely have, or I mean, I think what will happen is that all permits under the 2009 permit will be administratively terminated on that date, and then would have to seek coverage under the reissued permit in order to continue construction activities. As William Pan was mentioning earlier, there might be an issue when it comes to accepting notices of termination for review that may overlap with that boundary. And that's something that we'll have to work out here at the State Water Board when it comes to potentially administratively terminating coverage for sites that have covered for sites that are covered under the existing 2009 during the regulatory transition period.
Okay, thank you, Brandon.
Can I jump in really quickly?
Sure.
Just because that question referenced a 2-year transition period, I wanted to emphasize that there is also a 1-year period between proposed adoption and effective date. So it's 2 years after effective date, but it is 3 years total. So it is something that people can start planning now. Once the permit is adopted, if your project is not going to be complete during that time, you should start making plans to accommodate the new permit requirements as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Serena, for clarifying. And the last question from Paul is that there was a mention of a trained delegate. Brandon, you might have already responded to it, but I'll still read it just in case. There was a mention of a trained delegate. Can the delegate perform the inspection tasks noted on slide 34 at a site by themselves, or does the QSP or QSD must at least be on the site at that time? Is there specified and documented training needed for the delegate as part of an audit inspection?
It's a great question. I have touched upon it, but there's some nuances we can add into here. So the slide that we showed has trained delegates able to do weekly inspections, inactive project inspections, and post and during qualifying precipitation event inspections. They can perform those inspections without the QSP, qualified street practitioner, present on the site. That is the intent of having the trained delegates, to alleviate some of the burden on qualified street practitioners who may have multiple clients in a region that is being affected by a qualifying precipitation. The training that would have to be provided to a delegate that is conducting site-specific inspections and monitoring would be prepared by the qualified practitioner and or developer, and that trained delegate would have to sit down with the site's qualified street practitioner, or maybe even stand up and walk through the site, because a field trip or a field course is kind of inspected or is expected of the qualified street practitioners that are training their delegates. So yeah.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Paul, for your questions. I just want to do a quick check-in. I have just one more question in my chat. If the State Water Board staff, can you let me know if there are any other questions from emails? Because then we could either take a break soon and continue on with the Q&A, or we could kind of just power through and finish up with the few questions we have left. Because if we just have one more here, then maybe we can just power through. Perfect. Okay, I don't think we have that many more, so I'll just go ahead and move on to a question from Brian. It's a pretty long text referencing part of the permit, so I'm just going to go ahead and read it out loud. And if you have any questions, Brandon, please stop me and I can clarify.
I can try and find it too, so I can read along with you if you want.
It's directly to me. Let me go ahead and just see if I can copy this.
Or I meant the permit section.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so this is reference attachment D, E3. It reads additional risk level 2 requirement. Risk level 2 dischargers shall implement appropriate erosion control BMPs, runoff control and soil stabilization, in conjunction with sediment control BMPs for areas under active construction. Has that essentially been replaced in the draft permit with D2F1, risk level 2 and 3 dischargers shall implement the following additional erosion and sediment control BMPs for areas under active construction? A, design and construct cut and fill slopes in a manner to ensure slope stability and to minimize erosion, including but not limited to these practices.
I guess that's a reference to both permits.
Yeah.
Let's see.
If Brian, if there's anything you'd like to clarify yourself, if I'm not reading your question correctly, please feel free to clarify that for us.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, good morning. Thank you very much. I very much appreciate the staff's association with the stakeholders and some of the changes that have been put in the new draft. I'm very pleased to see those. Basically, in the 2009 permit, attachment D, section E, item number 3 is a rather broad pen stroke for areas under active construction. I'm pleased to see the draft change, if this is how I'm interpreting it, as more specific to slope stabilization instead of the broad pen stroke under the 09 permit with DE3. Is this correct perception that the draft is more towards slopes?
Yes, Brian, I think that's the intent of those additional risk level 2 and 3 requirements. Primarily because we expect those sites to be in generally steeper terrain, and therefore requiring that stabilization of the slopes be implemented during construction.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and that's good. I'm pleased to see that, because under the 09 permit DE3, and essentially per the letter of the permit, if discharger is blading a road, the specific letter of the permit would indicate they require stabilization while they're blading the road, and that's a broad pen stroke. Okay, thank you very much, Brandon.
Yep.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian, for that question. I appreciate that. Right. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the email questions. Looks like there is another one here from Dave. And the question is regarding attachment D, section 2F. So Brandon, maybe you would like to reference that part of the permit.
Yeah.
I don't know if it would be helpful to read the entire part. So the question to that part of the permit is, please explain how face of slope sediment controls can be implemented on active areas. And that was attachment D, section 2F. and it's additional risk level 2 and 3 requirements.
So it's actually the same section that we were just discussing
Okay,
with
perfect.
Brian. So it's nice and easy for me to locate that. I'm trying to find exactly where it says we need face of slope protections during active construction.
Yeah, it does say that in the introductory sentence to that section, Brandon. But I think the problem is that the active construction means that permanent stabilization has not been applied. It doesn't mean when graders or excavators are working on a slope. I mean, both of those are, forms of activity. But clearly the intent is that if it's an active site that no permanent stabilization has been applied to, then it, after the work is done, it needs to be, there has to be some BMPs put on it. But the other thing is that scheduling is really overlooked as a BMP for this kind of thing. And the fact of the matter is that a steep slope that it's going to have a lot of exposed soil should be done at a time when it's not raining and not expected to rain, so that then it can be stabilized before rain comes. And that's kind of a big part of the permit, but I think it gets overlooked a lot, that scheduling is actually a very important BMP.
Great. Thank you, Cabe, and thank you, Dave, for your question. I wanted to revisit, there was a question earlier that they followed up with some clarification. So I just want to read that question one more time and see we touched on it. This is from Hamid. The permit requires the SWIP and its BMPs to be site specific. How does the new inspection requirements comply with that? That was a question that was asked earlier. And the clarification was, this question is mainly on the regional forecast viability. So Brandon, I'm not sure does that clarify the question from earlier?
I don't think that helps me in answering the regional forecast viability.
Regional forecast viability. Hamid, if you're on this chat, or if you could follow up on that email, be happy to clarify that, or if you'd like to, I'm not sure if you're part of the Zoom meeting, but if you'd like to describe that question in a little more detail, we'd be happy to provide additional information.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So to start with, the local forecast means that we have sites that are less than half a mile of each other, have the same forecast, and we've had up to an inch of difference in rainfall. So some areas do not comply with the regional forecast. So that there goes the site specific, because in some areas it may not forecast for rain and it will forecast. I mean, it will rain. And then to put the rain at quarter inch, if you get 1/10 of an inch in 5 minutes, you will have erosion. So this is going back to requirements of the inspection, what triggers the inspections. The 1/2 inch of rain for sampling was to give dischargers room for the first flush. So we've hardly had any forecast that has been dead accurate. So by the time you have the rain happens and it's not forecasted, unless there is protection for the developers that are immune to the outcome of that, then it should go back to any rain event they should be ready for. That's my comment.
I see. Thank you. And to touch on that last part, I think our expectation is for developers to be ready for any storm event. But what we're requiring them to do is, I mean, for their inspections, is based on the forecast. And that said, I mean, we are still requiring the weekly inspections, and so those will be done prior to the precipitation event as well, and hopefully ensure that those best management practices are implemented appropriately to prevent the discharge of pollutants and erosion. Gabe, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I mean, this idea that forecasts are often wrong is anecdotal. When you actually look at the statistics, for a 5-day forecast, it's accurate 90% of the time. And so it's always easy to remember that 10% of the time when it was not accurate. But no one has shown me any data to show it, like in California, or I haven't found any, is what I should say. That shows that the forecasts are wildly inaccurate. So we have to kind of assume that they're going to be accurate. And then the other part of that is that the regional forecasts really aren't the ones that you should be trying to get. You should be trying to get as site specific as possible, which I know isn't always possible in every area, especially in the northern third of the state. Sometimes areas aren't really that well covered by the forecast. But even on the just general forecast map on the National Weather Service site, you can drag the little green box up to where your area is, and that should give a little better forecast for that area. But I think these problems that people are talking about with this new method, the benefits of it far outweigh the disadvantages of the old method. And I completely agree that rainfall intensity is a great measure of erosion, but again, you don't know that till it's over. So you can't use rainfall intensity as a predictive reason for inspection. Then you would be getting in, oh, there was a rainfall intensity of such and such amount, we got to run out there and do the inspection. That's not practical for most construction inspections.
Can I also chime in that I noticed that the comment keyed into the lack of protection. So the permit requirement only is triggered by a forecasted event. So although you should be ready for a rain event, if an event is not forecasted, that you did not complete a pre-event inspection is not a violation of the permit because the event was not forecasted. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear.
Thank you, Serena.
Great. Thank you, Serena, Cabe, and Ryan. I'm sorry, Serena, Cabe, and Brandon. Thank you for your comments. There was a follow-up from Dave on the earlier question regarding attachment D, section 2F. And the comment is that the permit language needs to be clear on intent. Your state active areas, so a grader will be on site. Limit to inactive areas. Thank you, Dave, for that follow-up. The next question we have is from Ram. And the question is, due to the limited availability of the QSD, many consultants have QSD who would develop the projects based on the plan and spec. They being said, a lot of time we have QSD who is located in, let's say, Southern California, developing a SWIP for a project located in Northern California, and subsequently the mandatory post-NAL exceedance site visit meeting might not be feasible in many cases. Does the Water Board consider the following? One, can the QSD form some form of video calling or virtual attendance instead of physical attendance at the meeting? And also, can the QSD who developed the SWIP assign a local QSD to attend the site meeting?
Those are great questions, Ring. I'm not exactly sure about the form of, like a virtual attendance. I think as a whole, our agency is trying to modernize a little bit, and so that might be something that we are open to. Say, for instance, that a trained delegate who's on site, has their smartphone and takes the QSD to the individual areas where the BMPs are being implemented. I think that might conform to the spirit of the requirement. But then number two, your option whether a QSD can assign a local QSD to attend the site meeting. Yes, that's absolutely allowed. So the requirement isn't necessarily for a single QSD to remain on site and be active throughout the duration of the project. Oftentimes we know that qualified SWIFT developers change throughout the process. And so what the discharger can do is originally have a qualified SWIFT developer base their SWIFT off the plans and spec, and then transition over to a local qualified SWIFT developer for their during project inspections and then any amendments to the SWIFT that needs to be made. So they don't have to stick with a single qualified SWIFT developer. The one caveat there, though, is whenever there is a switch of a qualified SWIFT developer, they have to perform an on-site inspection in order to become familiar with the site's SWIFT and implementation of best management practices. And to maybe add a little bit further clarification or additional detail, the qualified SWIFT developers are now expected to visit the site twice annually. And that can kind of be paired with any numeric action level inspections, or if a QST is swapped out and one has to come in and do their initial inspection, that counts as their first annual inspection as well. So there's a little bit of double dipping allowed in those requirements as well.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Ram, for your question. All right. The last question that I have is from Arthur. And the question is, if the proposed construction general permit goes into effect on July 1st, 2023, could a new project, which starts 3 months earlier, let's say April 15th of 2023, and it has a lifespan of more than 2 or 3 years, do they apply for a new permit instead of the current permit, which expires on June 30th, 2023?
So it's up to the discharger to determine which permit they want to be covered at that point. If they're starting in April, then they would likely be getting coverage under the existing 2009 permit. They can decide to switch coverage once the new permit goes effective. But eventually, once the regulatory transition period does end, they will be forced to switch coverage if their project is not completed. I don't know if force is the right word, but like it will be required that the project be covered under the reissue. And to clarify, the proposed effective date will be September 1st, not July 1st, 2020.
Perfect. Thank you, Brandon, and thank you, Arthur, for your question. I just want to take a moment and check in with Statewide board staff. Were there any questions that I may have overlooked or any other emails coming in? Because I do not see any more questions in the chat. Okay, perfect. So no more questions from the email. If you have any other questions right now, otherwise we will transition to our closing remarks. So feel free to raise your hand or put your questions in right now, and we can go ahead and respond to those. Just wait just a little bit to see if anything comes in. Okay, I do not see any more chats, so I think we can go ahead and move on to the last couple slides. And if any last minute questions come in, maybe we could quickly respond to those after the closing remarks.
Sure. Let me go ahead and advance the slide. Computer's kind of freezing up here. Okay. So we just want to leave everyone with some reminders. August 23rd, 2022 is the date where you can submit your public comments, or is the due date for when you can submit your public comments regarding the revised anti-degradation findings in fact sheet section IH2. And then the board meeting is scheduled for September 8th. I believe that's a Thursday as opposed to the usual Tuesday of 2022. And the board members will be considering adoption of the proposed permit at that time. So I do want to emphasize that this board meeting to consider adoption is an opportunity for the public to provide feedback and comments to the board members directly. So they may have been on this workshop and listening to your comments. However, if you want to provide those comments directly to the board members that may weigh in on the decision making, the board meeting to consider adoption is the time to do that. So for instance, if a discharger really wants the effective date of the permit to be extended, you should make that a clear statement during the meeting to consider adoption of the permit. Same goes for the duration of the regulatory transition time. Anything else I need to remind people of?
Not that I know of. I think that's it. And then if we could just go to the last slide, and I'll thank everyone. Before we conclude, I just wanted to extend a big thank you to our CGP Reissuance team and colleagues at Office of Chief Counsel, Office of Enforcement, and the Regional Water Quality Control Boards. Each one of these individuals has brought a different skill set, and it's all crucial in completing the permit. I also want to give a big thank you to our attendees today for joining us. And thank you for those of you who have submitted comments or met with staffs throughout the reissuance process. Your input on the permit is a massive component of making the permit workable for the regulated community and for other interested parties. And so just as a reminder, you can always contact staff through the Stormwater Help Desk. If you have any remaining questions on the permit or the reissuance process, you can email us at the Stormwater Help Desk email, which is stormwater@waterboards.ca.gov. So thank you once again for your participation today. Hope you all have a great rest of your afternoon. And I think staff may hang out for just a couple more minutes to see if anything else comes up, but otherwise that will conclude our public workshop for today. So thank you all very much.
And we're hoping to post a recording of this workshop relatively soon on our program page, as well as our presentation materials. For the presentations that the interested parties delivered, we'll likely not post those. And you can contact Stormwater, the Stormwater Help Desk in order to get those.
So one thing we didn't really cover in this meeting, and the reason we didn't is because of its complexity, but there were several questions or interest in where the total suspended solids surrogate proxy was, how it was developed and why it was developed. And there's a bunch of different lines of research that led to that. And so I'm thinking that might be better answered either in a little separate video meeting between people who are interested in that, or even one-on-one with the stakeholders that had that concern. It's a little hard to deliver that information ad hoc. I'll be the first to admit. I mean, I would like to have some notes and maybe some slides in front of me to really get into it, but it is it's the best surrogate that we have found essentially for everything that it needs to do, and clearly we've got a problem because the organochlorine pesticides are different than the metals. And so we needed to find something that could sort of address both of those. And that's where it came from. But I would be happy to put together a little more formal presentation on that if anybody would like it.
Much appreciated, Kate. We can even, like you said, we can do that through stakeholder meetings. Or we could also potentially have a recording that we post, kind of an addendum to this meeting that kind of details our thoughts there. I'm sure the regulated community would be heavily interested in that. Great. Are we getting any more questions?
Nope, I do not see anything else coming in.
I think we are good to end the meeting.
Great. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, everyone.